Hi, this is Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer. And today's video is an attempt to answer the question of how much notice must a landlord give a tenant prior to terminating the month-to-month tenancy so that landlord can sell the property to a buyer tenant-free. In other words, seller is selling property. Let's assume it's a single-family residence, although it doesn't have to be. Single-family residence currently has a tenant in it. They're going to sell it to a buyer. Buyer wants to own or occupy the property. And so when they close, they don't want the tenant to still be in residency. The Landlord-Tenant Act controls the answer to this question. Unfortunately, the Landlord-Tenant Act was revised in 2019, and the language that was used in the revision makes it unclear as to whether this landlord must give 20 days notice or 120 days notice. And so I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you that landlord lawyers who have the luxury of giving the most conservative advice tell their clients, their landlords, to give 120 days notice to a tenant prior to terminating the tenancy so that a buyer can take so the buyer can take possession owner occupied. Why? Because the language in the 2019 revision, while it kept intact the initial statement that terminating a month-to-month tenancy requires 20 days notice, it then created a number of exceptions to that rule and imposed a greater notice period. One of those exceptions is that if the landlord is going to change the use of the property, landlord must give 120 days notice before terminating tenancies. And the question that landlord lawyers are struggling to answer is, when a property is converted from the use by an investor for tenant occupancy to the use by an owner occupant for owner occupancy, is that the change in use that was intended by the statutory provision? And until a court answers that question, we won't know the answer to that question. So when a landlord goes to their lawyer today and says, I have a month-to-month tenancy, how much notice do I have to give before I can get the landlord out? Before I can get the tenant out so that a new buyer can take possession when they own the property, the lawyer will ask the landlord, what's the status of your sale? And if the landlord says, I don't even have it on the market yet, then the lawyer's advice is going to be 120 days. If the landlord says, oh, well, I've already got a buyer and we're pending closing in 45 days, then the lawyer's going to acknowledge that the landlord's hands are tied at that point, and the most notice they can give is, well, immediate notice, but statutorily, meeting a statutorily time frame, the only time frame they're going to be able to hit is the 20-day notice. Question is, if the tenant refuses to move and if litigation becomes necessary, will a court determine that the 20-day notice from the landlord was sufficient to terminate the tenancy so that the landlord could change the use of the property from investment to owner-occupied? Now here's an important distinction. If the transaction closes with the tenant in occupancy, then there's no question but what the new owner can give 20 days notice to terminate. The owner-occupant, if the owner of the property wants to move themselves or family members into the property, then the statute's very clear. 20 days notice is all that's required. The unknown answer, the unknown portion of this question, is whether the investor seller can get by with 20 days notice or whether they are required to deliver 120 days notice. And there is a good argument to make on the other side of this equation that says, no, they don't have to give 120 days notice. That was not the intention behind the word use. There are other definitions we can throw in there. But there's also an argument to be made that it is 120 days, which is why landlord lawyers are giving that conservative advice. So if you're a listing broker representing a seller in this situation, what answer are you going to give to the seller? If the seller has the luxury of giving 120 days notice, then it's an easy answer for you to give. Tell them they have to give 120 days notice. But if your seller's already in a bind and can't give 120 days notice, you need to send that seller to legal counsel. Let the seller go talk to their own lawyer about what they need to do in order to get that tenant out of the property. If you have questions on this or anything else, Send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.